So what kinds of data are used in qualitative studies? How do we conduct qualitative studies? We've talked about things that we do to quantify information using composite scales or other forms of variables, and we spent some time last week talking about that. Similarly, there are forms of investigation and methods of inquiry that we use in qualitative studies. Some of them you're very familiar with as social workers. So for example, a core tool of qualitative researchers are interviews. You go and you actually talk to people. We can also directly observe things. We can sit and watch how people behave. Sometimes we can access archival or historical data, and that provides some information. We can read things, read what people wrote about certain experiences. And then we can also examine artifacts, statues or art or something like that. There are a number of forms of interviews used in qualitative work. So for example, interviews can be open-ended or closed-ended. I can ask you questions like, what is your experience of depression like? And then you can say anything you want. Versus a more closed-ended question, I can say, other people have described depression as being a black dog. Is that something you've experienced? So I can, qualitative interviews mostly tend toward the open-ended because you want to do that inductive process of being open to the experience being presented to you by the research participant. But they don't have to be open-ended. They can also be closed-ended. The purpose of these open-ended interviews is to explore something in depth without imposing a structure on it. And again, this gets back to this inductive versus deductive process of reasoning, where we want to be as open to the experience being shared with us as possible. And that means we need to have our biases in check. We need to understand what it is how we want to filter the data and try and set that aside or bracket it, as it is often called in qualitative kinds of circles. And we want to be as open as possible to the experience being shared with us. Now that's also a very good clinical perspective, but qualitative research isn't the same as clinical research, as clinical interviewing. So for example, in clinical interviewing, you'll often want to reflect back to your client how they're feeling to check in to make sure that you're understanding what they're saying. So you might say something like, it sounds to me like that made you really sad. Well, that's great for clinical work. That's not great for qualitative research because we want to not impose a structure. We don't want to push that back to somebody and have them reflect on that. We want to hear in their own voice and be very open to their own voice without projecting onto it. The focus is on the participant and the participant's meaning of their words, how they're using their language, and how they're describing their experience. Interviews can take place in a number of ways. We can do face-to-face interviews, which transmit a lot of information. You get a lot of sense of what's going on for somebody by talking to them face-to-face. We can also talk to folks by telephone, which provides less information than face-to-face interviews do because you don't have the person's direct reaction to you and interaction with you to draw information from. But it's also a lot more convenient to do telephone interviews. We can also, in modern interviewing, we can use Skype to sort of get in between. Although Skype is not the same as face-to-face, it's certainly more information than doing something like telephone interviews. So there's a lot of ways that we can get in contact with people in order to get information from them and to interview them. There are also many different types of interviews. While we had mentioned earlier that there's open and closed-ended questions, there are structured and unstructured interviews. So I might have a set of questions that I'm going to go through and ask you. So recently I was involved in a project where we were trying to understand assertive community treatment teams' use of technology, and we had a set of questions. Do you use technology with your clients? What kinds of forms of technology do you use? Do you like using the technology? Do you think it enhances the clinical experience? Would you like to have more access to technology or less access? We had a set of structured questions that we were interested in asking, and we weren't just open-ended saying, what do you think of technology? So if I were more interested in exploring things in an open perspective rather than a set of specific questions, I could use an unstructured set of interview questions where I might start with something very broad, such as, what do you think of technology and assertive community treatment teams? Not imposing any sign of structure on it, not imposing any set of objectives to get out of the conversation, but just an open question that the person then can take, and then I can follow where the person goes and use their feedback and their conversation and their exploration of the issue to sort of move the conversation forward, but I'm not guiding the conversation in a structured way. That's not what we did. We wanted to know a specific set of questions. How do you use technology? What technology do you use? What kind of problems do you have with clients using technology? Do you think your clients would be able to use technology? We wanted to know these specific things, so we used a set of structured interviews. Now, between these structured and totally unstructured set of questions are semi-structured questions. So I might ask somebody start with a more open-ended question. What do you think of technology use in assertive community treatment teams? And then I have some idea that I also want to ask about how clients use technology, or how comfortable they feel with technology. So I can have something in between where I'm generally open-ended and allowing the participant to take the conversation where they want to go, but I can also guide it into certain locations. So I don't want you to think of these as completely opposite. I would think of them as a continuum from I'm asking very specific questions that I want to hear your response to I have no idea what I want this conversation to be about, to somewhere in between where I really want to allow you to speak as a participant. I want to hear what you have to say. I don't want to impose too much structure, but I do want to cover these topics, and that would be a semi-structured interview. Sometimes there are more specific forms of interviews that I want to do. So I might have key informants that I want to talk to, and those are called key informant interviews. Key informants would be if I wanted to understand how managers of a child welfare agency operate under stress. I could go talk to specific people about that with a specific set of questions for them. There's also focus groups, which are another specific form of qualitative interviewing style that we use a lot. And many of you have probably participated in focus groups where you get together a group of people and you ask that group a set of questions. A second form of inquiry used by qualitative researchers is observation. And observation is just the process of going and watching people. So you can go, anytime, people often like people watching in airports. You can go sit and you can watch and you see the families and the business people and the people going to a job, or the people going back to their lover, or whatever the experience is that you can sort of imagine people doing as they walk through airports. So many of us have had experiences of people watching, or clinically, we do this all the time as social workers, where you'll go to a client's house and you'll observe what's going on in the house. Does the house look safe? Does the house look clean? All sorts of things that we can pick up by directly observing. There are some specific forms of qualitative research that are based on observation. And again, these aren't mutually exclusive with things like interviewing. People will often do both interviews and observations. But anthropologists in particular use this method of observation to understand what's going on. They'll go and they'll embed themselves in a culture and they'll observe what's going on. Now, there are two basic types of observation that you can use. One is unobtrusive observation, where you're sort of standing out of the way. You're the person in the airport sitting off in the corner watching what's going on, and nobody's really paying attention to the fact that you're watching. You're not interacting with anybody. You're very unobtrusive into other people's lives, but you're still observing what's going on, so you're observing from a distance. The alternative is participant observation, where it's a more obtrusive form of observation, where you're engaging with people, you're talking with people. So there's a famous psychological study of schizophrenia in Ireland, and the participant went and moved into a village, the anthropologist, I'm sorry, went and moved into a village and interacted with the people. She went to the pub and talked to folks, and she was involved in the daily life of folks, and she got herself embedded into the community that she was studying. And so she wasn't unobtrusive, she wasn't standing outside, she was there as an observer interacting with those that are being observed, but doing so in a way that was constantly bumping into people. And those two forms of knowing, both the unobserved or the unobtrusive and the obtrusive forms, give you sort of different information. When people know they're being watched, they're going to behave differently. But by interacting with them, you can get more information. Sometimes the distance is helpful in that it gives you a more objective view of what people are doing because you're standing back from it. So you're not affecting what people are doing. They're not worried about how their behaviors are affecting your observation. Versus when you actually sit down with people and talk with them, they're going to give you a slightly different story than if you could be a fly on the wall hearing what they have to say. But you can also get more information out of them because you're actually directly engaging with them. As with interviews, we can have unstructured observation or structured observation. So unstructured observation would be just sitting and watching and just letting whatever is happening to you come. Structured observations are something we often use with child care assessments. So I might go into a child care setting and sit and watch how a parent is interacting with their child, but I have a specific set of things that I'm looking for. So it's a very structured set of observations. I'm looking at how far the child will move away from the parent. And does the child come back to the parent when the child encounters something that it's a little uncertain about? Does the child look back, or does the child just run off and bolt for it? You know, so there's different forms of observations, again, stretching from this sort of unstructured, letting the environment come to you and being receptive to whatever comes, to imposing more of a structure on top of the environment and seeing how the environment pushes back against that structure. So as with interviews, where I can have both unstructured to structured, observation can also exist on that continuum from more open to the experience and just letting whatever come to placing a set of specific forms of understanding onto the observation. Less used in social work qualitative research are archival data, which is a lot of what history is based on. You know, historical research is almost entirely based on qualitative assessments of historical data. So you might go back and read letters from Roman senators to their wives, or from you know, World War I generals, or whatever. And so those do represent forms of understanding. You know, we do some of this archival work. If we're going back and looking into information about a client in the clinical record, we might go back and look at what caseworkers wrote in their notes about another client. That's a form of qualitative inquiry using historical data. And we could do studies using that form of data about how people made decisions or how they documented their decisions. Also, artifacts tell us something. We don't really use this. Again, this is more of an archaeological kind of way of understanding, or an anthropological way of understanding. But we certainly do look at how people present and how they carry them, you know, what they carry with them and what they think are important, what people's jewelry looks like, or other things like that. So we do use these sort of material object forms of assessments as well, but they're less research oriented in social work than in some other disciplines.